It is 11:47 at night. The kitchen light is still on, casting that pale yellow glow across the linoleum floor, and a man sits at the table with a stack of bills pressed flat under his left palm, his right hand wrapped around a coffee mug that went cold an hour ago. He is not reading the bills anymore. He stopped reading them 20 minutes ago. He is just sitting there, staring at the number at the bottom of the page, that final, brutal number, and somewhere behind his sternum, 3 fingers below the collarbone, there is a weight that has no name, but every man and woman in that situation knows exactly where it lives. He can hear his children sleeping down the hall. He can hear his partner's slow, exhausted breathing from the bedroom. And in the silence of that kitchen, in the space between the ticking clock and the hum of the refrigerator, a question rises up from somewhere so deep it barely feels like a thought. It feels more like a verdict. What if this is all there is? That question, that single, terrifying question, is the reason we are here tonight. Because Napoleon Hill spent more than 20 years of his life walking into rooms exactly like that one. Not as the man sitting at the table, but as the student, the investigator, the relentless chronicler of human potential and human failure. He sat across from the wealthiest industrialists in American history. He walked the corridors of Carnegie Steel and the boardrooms of Edison's laboratories. And again, in every conversation, in every quiet moment of revelation, he found the same pattern, not a pattern of luck, not a pattern of inheritance or education or geography, a pattern of the mind, a pattern so consistent, so reproducible, so ruthlessly honest that it shook him to his foundation. And tonight, that pattern is going to be laid bare for the first time in a way that most people who claim to understand Napoleon Hill have never truly grasped. Because the part of his teaching that the world most frequently overlooks is not the loudest part. It is the quietest pews. Before we go any further, there is something you need to understand. And to understand it, we have to step back from the kitchen table, from the bills and the cold coffee, and we have to look at something that happened in the life of an ordinary man, a man whose name most people have never heard, which is precisely the point. His name was Edward. He was 38 years old, living in a mid-sized American city in the 1930s, working as a junior accountant for a firm that barely noticed he existed. From the outside, Edward looked fine. He wore pressed shirts. He smiled at the right moments. He arrived at work on time every single morning without exception. His supervisor, if asked, would have said Edward was reliable, steady, a good worker. His neighbors would have called him pleasant. His family would have called him present. Edward looked, by every external measure, like a man who had his life under control. But inside, in the place behind his eyes, where the day accumulates and the real accounting happens, Edward was in freefall. Every night, he went home and sat in his chair and felt the hollow, nauseating sensation of time moving past him. He had a dream, a real dream, specific and burning, the kind of dream that Napoleon Hill would have recognized instantly as the raw material of great achievement. Edward wanted to build something. He had an idea for a business, a service, a model that he had sketched and resketched in notebooks he kept hidden in the bottom drawer of his desk. He had the knowledge, he had the contacts. He had, by his own assessment, everything he needed except one thing, and that one thing was not money. It was not education. It was not connection. It was silence. Not the silence of the kitchen at midnight, a different kind of silence. The silence that Napoleon Hill called the Supreme Court of the Mind. The silence that separates the man who acts from the man who merely thinks about acting. And because Edward never learned to find that silence, never learned to use it, never understood what it was for, he stayed in that chair. He stayed in that office. He stayed in that life that looked fine from the outside and was quietly destroying him from within. And when Edward was 61 years old, he retired with a pension and a handshake and a cake from the break room. And he went home, and he sat in the same chair, and he opened that bottom drawer, and he looked at those notebooks and the weight behind his sternum. That weight 3 fingers below the collarbone became so heavy, it was almost physical. Edward died 4 years later. He died with his potential intact. He died with his notebooks full of ideas that never became anything. And the most devastating part of that story is not what Edward lost. It is what his children lost, what his grandchildren lost, what the people whose lives his business might have changed never received. The tragedy of a man who looked fine from the outside is not personal. It is generational. Now, if you have been watching this and something in your chest has shifted, something has tightened or opened or quietly begun to ache, that is not an accident. That is recognition. And if this is the kind of truth that you believe should reach more people, that the silence inside you is not emptiness but power, then share this with someone who needs it tonight. Because what you're about to hear is not motivational content. It is not a collection of quotes rearranged to sound inspiring. This is the operating system of the mind, decoded, explained, and handed to you with the same urgency that Napoleon Hill felt when he first understood it. And if you want to be the first to receive every piece of this teaching as it arrives, then make sure you're subscribed, because the people who are here consistently are the ones who build the habit of feeding their mind what it actually needs. Bueno, now we go deeper. Here's the first paradox, and it is one that Napoleon Hill returned to again and again in his research, sometimes explicitly, sometimes between the lines, in a way that only reveals itself when you read him slowly and carefully. The paradox is this: the louder a man speaks about wanting to succeed, the further he is from success, and the more desperately a man fills his mind with noise, with distraction, with the constant management of surface-level problems, the more completely he seals himself off from the very intelligence that could solve them. Think about that for a moment. The man who is most desperate to escape his situation is the man who is most furiously busy, most constantly distracted, most addicted to the noise of his own anxiety. And that busyness, that noise, that constant mental static is the exact mechanism by which the subconscious mind is prevented from doing its most extraordinary work. This is not mysticism. This is not philosophy for the sake of philosophy. Napoleon Hill was a pragmatist above all things. He had no patience for ideas that could not be translated into results. And when he described what he called the great silence, the deliberate, disciplined cultivation of mental stillness, he was describing a technology, a tool as precise and as powerful as any machine Carnegie ever built or Edison ever wired. A tool that the wealthiest minds in human history had used, consciously or intuitively, to attract solutions, connections, resources, and ideas that lesser minds called luck. Deham pensar un momento, because the word attract is important here, and it is also the word most frequently misunderstood. When Napoleon Hill spoke of attraction, he was not describing a passive process. He was not suggesting that a man could sit in a room and think pleasant thoughts and watch the money appear. What he was describing was something far more precise, far more demanding, and far more interesting than that. He was describing the way the subconscious mind, when given a clear, emotionally charged instruction and then allowed to operate in the absence of conscious interference, will begin to reorganize the entire field of a person's perception. Their attention will shift. They will begin to notice things they previously walked past. Opportunities that were always there will suddenly become visible. Connections that seemed impossible will present themselves. Not because the universe rearranged itself, but because the human mind, when it is properly programmed and then given silence in which to work, becomes a precision instrument for identifying exactly what it has been told to find. Espera. And here is where we must be brutally honest. Because most people reading or watching content about Napoleon Hill stop at the inspiring part and never reach the demanding part. They hear the word silence, and they think it means rest. They think it means meditation in the soft, comfortable sense. They think it means taking a break from the noise. And so they try it once or twice. They sit quietly for 10 minutes. They feel slightly calmer, and then they go back to their lives unchanged, because they never understood what the silence was for. They never understood that silence, in the Hillian sense, is not the absence of noise. It is the presence of intention. It is the state in which a man deliberately introduces a specific, burning, precisely defined desire into the deepest layer of his own mind and then holds that space with enough discipline to let the mind do what the mind is built to do. Now let us talk about what happens when this is not done. And let us talk about it not in abstract terms, but in the specific, uncomfortable, honest terms that Napoleon Hill used when he was not writing for a general audience, but speaking directly to the men who came to him, asking why they had not yet succeeded. The man who does not cultivate silence is not simply missing a technique. He is living in a state of chronic self-sabotage that he cannot see because he is too deep inside it. Every morning, he wakes up with the same low-grade anxiety sitting in the muscles of his shoulders and the back of his jaw. Every day, he reacts to the same set of circumstances, the same financial pressures, the same interpersonal friction, the same sense that the world is moving forward and he is somehow standing still. And every night he lies down and the last thought before sleep is some variation of the same worry, the same fear, the same unresolved tension. And what does this do to the subconscious mind? It programs it precisely and powerfully. It programs it for more of the same. Because the subconscious mind does not evaluate what it receives. It does not distinguish between a command and a complaint. It does not understand the difference between what you want and what you fear. It simply receives the dominant thought, the thought that is most emotionally charged, the thought that you return to most frequently, and it treats that thought as instruction. Pews, if the dominant thought in your mind is fear of poverty, the subconscious will organize your behavior, your decisions, your perception of opportunity around the avoidance of poverty, not around the creation of wealth, around the avoidance of loss. And those are not the same thing. They are not even close to the same thing. The man who is organized around avoiding poverty makes different decisions than the man who is organized around creating wealth. He sees different things. He attracts different people. He responds differently to risk. He interprets setbacks differently. He is, in a very real and measurable sense, a different instrument. And the only thing that separates them, the only fundamental difference between these two men, is the content of the dominant thought that runs through their minds during the hours when they are not consciously directing their attention. This is the tragedy that Napoleon Hill saw everywhere he looked. Not the tragedy of men who lacked talent or intelligence or opportunity. The tragedy of men who had all three and who were using the most powerful instrument in the known universe, the human mind, to build a prison for themselves, brick by brick, thought by thought, day by day, while telling themselves they were working hard and trying their best and doing everything they could. And here's the part that should keep you awake tonight. Not with anxiety, but with the cold clarity of a man who has just understood something he cannot ununderstand. That prison does not stay inside you. It does not confine only you. It reaches forward into time, and it shapes the minds of your children, because children do not learn their relationship with money from what their parents say. They learn it from what their parents feel. They learn it from the tension in the room when the bills arrive. They learn it from the way their father's voice changes when he talks about money. They learn it from the posture their mother takes on when someone mentions the future. They absorb the emotional frequency of scarcity the way they absorb language effortlessly, completely, before they have the cognitive tools to question it. And then they carry it forward. And then they pass it on. And the man who sat at the kitchen table at 11:47 at night and never learned to use the silence has not only failed himself, he has contributed to a chain of limitation that could extend for 3, 4, 5 generations before someone finally breaks it. That is what is at stake. Not just your financial situation, not just your career or your business or your investments. The inheritance you leave your children is not primarily monetary. It is mental. And the mind you give them is the mind they see operating in you every single day. In the kitchen, in the car, at the dinner table. In the way you respond to setbacks. In the way you talk about people who have more than you. In the way your body changes when the conversation turns to money. Aware. Now you understand why Napoleon Hill was so relentless. Now you understand why he said with a certainty that some people found arrogant and others found liberating, that poverty is a mental disease, not a moral failing, not a character flaw, a disease of the mind. Specifically, a disease of the programming that runs beneath conscious thought. A disease that is invisible, inherited, and almost perfectly self-perpetuating. And, like all diseases, it is curable. But the cure requires understanding the mechanism first. So let us talk about the mechanism. Let us talk about what Napoleon Hill actually meant when he described the power of silence, not as a concept, but as a practice, not as an attitude, but as a technology. And let us be specific enough that when you finish watching this, you have something you can use tonight. The first principle is what Hill called the definiteness of purpose. And before you dismiss that as something you have heard before, stay with me, because the version of this principle that most people carry is a pale shadow of what Hill actually meant. Most people understand definiteness of purpose as goal setting. They think it means writing down what you want, attaching a number to it, giving it a deadline. And that is not wrong, but it is so incomplete that it barely matters. What Hill meant by definiteness of purpose was something closer to obsession than to goal setting. He meant the kind of desire that you can feel in the muscles of your forearms when you think about it. The kind of clarity that produces a physical response, a quickening in the chest, a sharpening behind the eyes. He meant a desire so specific, so emotionally loaded, so completely real to you in your imagination, that the subconscious mind receives it not as a wish, but as a fact to be realized. And here's the paradox that most people miss. The man who has a vague, comfortable, reasonable desire will produce vague, comfortable, reasonable results. But the man who has a burning, unreasonable, specific desire, the man who can close his eyes and see the thing he wants with the clarity of a memory rather than the blur of a fantasy, that man has already begun the process of its creation. Because the subconscious mind cannot distinguish between a vivid, imagined experience and a real one. This is not a metaphor. This is a neurological fact that modern science has confirmed with the kind of precision that Hill could only gesture toward in the 1930s. The same neural pathways that fire when you experience something fire when you vividly imagine it. The subconscious mind responds to the emotional content of thought, not its literal truth. Bueno. So the first practice is this. Find 10 minutes of genuine silence every single day. Not background music silence. Not the silence of a distracted mind that is still running its anxiety loops in the background. Genuine, intentional, deliberately cultivated silence. And in that silence, introduce your desire, not as a hope, not as a question, as a statement of fact. As a reality that exists in the future and toward which your mind is now being pointed like a compass needle toward north. Feel it in your body. Find the place in your chest, slightly to the left of center, where excitement lives when it is real. Find the warmth that spreads upward through the throat when you're fully committed to something. That sensation is not decoration. That sensation is the emotional charge that the subconscious mind requires in order to register an instruction as a priority. Dejam pensar un momento about why this is so counterintuitive for most people. Because most people have been trained by education, by culture, by the well-meaning advice of people who were themselves afraid to suppress that kind of desire, to be reasonable, to be realistic, to manage their expectations. And every time a man suppresses a burning desire in the name of being realistic, he is not protecting himself from disappointment. He is cutting the wire between his conscious mind and the most powerful part of his own intelligence. He is choosing the safety of a small life over the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of a large one. Espera. Because there's a second loop that we have not yet closed, and it connects everything. We talked about Edward, the man with the notebooks in the bottom drawer, the man who looked fine from the outside and was collapsing inside, and we said that what he lacked was silence. But now we can be more precise. What Edward lacked was not simply the practice of silence. He lacked the courage to use silence honestly, because genuine silence, the kind that Napoleon Hill prescribed, does not just reveal your desires, it reveals your fears. And in the gap between a man's desires and his fears, his entire life is being secretly determined. Most people, when they sit in silence, encounter their fears almost immediately. The fear that they are not enough, the fear that they will fail publicly, the fear that success will change them, or that people they love will resent them for it, the fear that wanting more is somehow greedy or ungrateful. These fears are not random. They are programmed. They were installed by voices that spoke to you before you had the language to evaluate what they were saying. And they run continuously, beneath the level of conscious thought, shaping every decision, every risk assessment, every moment of hesitation. And here is the most devastating paradox of all. The things that frighten you most are almost always pointing directly at the things you most need to do. Aver, the fear of financial failure that keeps a man from starting his business, is the exact same energy, the same intensity of feeling, the same neural activation as the passion for the business itself. They are two faces of the same force. The man who is terrified of poverty is not less motivated than the man who burns for wealth. He is equally motivated, but his motivation is pointed in the wrong direction. It is pointed away from what he wants rather than toward it. And the silence, the real silence, the honest silence, is the space in which a man can feel that fear fully, recognize it for what it is, a misdirected form of his own power, and consciously choose to redirect it. This is what Napoleon Hill meant when he talked about transmutation. Not the mystical version that some readers take literally, but the practical, psychological, brutally honest version. The transmutation of fear into faith. The transmutation of anxiety into action. The transmutation of the energy that keeps a man frozen into the energy that sets him in motion. And it begins in silence. It begins in those 10 minutes of genuine stillness, when a man is honest enough to feel what he actually feels and clear-eyed enough to choose what he actually wants. Now, the second principle. Hill called it the mastermind, and like definiteness of purpose, this concept is frequently reduced to a pale shadow of its actual meaning. Most people understand the mastermind as a networking group. They think it means surrounding yourself with smart people. And again, that is not wrong, but it is so incomplete as to be almost useless. What Hill meant by the mastermind was something with a specific architecture, a specific quality of relationship, a specific kind of alliance that is fundamentally different from professional networking or social connection. The mastermind, as Hill defined it, is a group of two or more people who come together in a spirit of perfect harmony around a shared, clearly defined purpose, and who agree to contribute not just their knowledge or their contacts, but their full mental and emotional energy to the pursuit of that purpose. The key word is harmony. Not agreement, not politeness, not the careful management of professional relationships. Harmony, The kind of harmony that exists when two or more minds are so genuinely aligned in their purpose and their commitment that they create, as Hill put it, a third mind, an invisible intelligence that is greater than the sum of its parts. Pews. This is not a metaphor either. When two or more people are deeply aligned in purpose and genuinely supportive of each other, the quality of their collective thinking is measurably different from the sum of their individual thinking. Problems that seemed unsolvable become solvable. Connections that seemed inaccessible become accessible. Opportunities that neither person could have identified alone become visible to both. This is not magic. It is the result of what happens when the mental and emotional resources of two or more people are genuinely combined, rather than politely shared. And here is the practical instruction. Look at the 5 people you spend the most time with. Not because of the cliché about being the average of them, but because of something more specific and more demanding. Look at the dominant emotional frequency of those relationships. Are these people building something? Are they in motion towards something that excites them? Is the dominant tone of your conversations with them one of possibility and forward momentum, or one of complaint, comparison, and comfortable resignation? Because whatever the dominant emotional frequency of those relationships is, it is entering your subconscious mind every single day. It is mixing with your own programming, and it is either amplifying your desire or diluting it. This is not about abandoning people who are struggling. Napoleon Hill was never cruel, and his teaching is not an instruction to be indifferent to the people you love. It is an instruction to be honest about the difference between a relationship that is pulling you forward and a relationship that is holding you in place. And it is an instruction to actively seek, to deliberately pursue, to be willing to be uncomfortable in the pursuit of the relationships that belong to the mastermind category. The people who are themselves in motion. The people who respond to your desire, not with caution and concern, but with the kind of recognition that says, yes, I see what you are building, and I want to help you build it. Bueno. Third principle, autosuggestion. This is the one that most people approach with the most skepticism, and it is the one that, when properly understood and properly practiced, produces the most rapid and the most dramatic results. Napoleon Hill defined autosuggestion as the agency of communication between the conscious and subconscious mind. In simpler terms, it is the deliberate use of your own voice, your own words, spoken or written or silently felt, to introduce new programming into the subconscious layer of thought. The reason most people's attempts at autosuggestion fail is that they approach it as an intellectual exercise. They write affirmations, they repeat them mechanically. They say the words without feeling them. And the subconscious mind, which is not fooled by performance, ignores them completely. Because the subconscious mind does not respond to words. It responds to the emotional charge that the words carry. An affirmation spoken without conviction is not autosuggestion. It is noise, and the subconscious mind, which is already saturated with noise, simply files it alongside everything else it has decided to ignore. Aware. So here's the practice. Here's the specific, demanding, honest practice that Hill prescribed and that the men who actually applied it found to be genuinely transformative. Take your definiteness of purpose, that burning, specific, emotionally charged desire. Write it out in precise language. Not vague language, not inspirational language. Precise language with a specific number attached to it if it is financial, with a specific outcome described if it is not, with a specific timeline that is ambitious enough to excite you and realistic enough to be believed by some part of your mind. And then in your 10 minutes of silence, read it aloud to yourself, not as performance, not as recitation, as a man who is telling himself a truth, with the same tone of voice you would use to tell someone you love about something that has already happened and that you're proud of. Dejam pensar un momento about what this actually does neurologically and psychologically. When you speak aloud in a specific tone of voice with specific emotional content, you are engaging not just the visual and verbal centers of the brain, but the auditory and motor systems as well. You're creating a richer, more complete neural representation of the desired outcome. You are, in effect, making it more real to your own mind. And the more real it becomes to your mind, the more completely your subconscious will treat it as an existing fact rather than a distant possibility. And the more completely your subconscious treats it as an existing fact, the more powerfully it will organize your perception, your intuition, your behavior, and your energy toward its realization. Espera, because there is one more thing that needs to be said about autosuggestion, something that Hill said explicitly, but that most summaries of his work omit because it is uncomfortable. He said that the subconscious mind is most receptive to suggestion during 2 specific periods: the moments just before sleep and the moments just after waking. These are the threshold states, the moments when the boundary between the conscious and subconscious mind is thinnest, when the gatekeeping function of critical conscious thought is temporarily reduced. And he said that what a man introduces into his mind during these threshold states has a disproportionate influence on his overall mental programming, which means that the man who lies down at night with his mind full of financial fear and unresolved anxiety is using the most powerful window of mental influence he has every single day to reinforce exactly the programming that is keeping him poor. And the man who uses those same threshold moments to deliberately, intentionally, emotionally introduce his burning desire into his subconscious mind is using the same window to compound his programming toward wealth day after day, night after night, in a way that eventually becomes unstoppable. Pugh's fourth principle, the cultivation of faith. And here, Hill is most frequently misunderstood, because when modern audiences hear the word faith, they often interpret it in a religious context, and they either embrace it or dismiss it on those terms. But Hill's use of the word had nothing to do with religion. What he meant by faith was something closer to what we would now call a trained expectation, a deep subconscious conviction that a specific outcome is not merely possible but inevitable. Not hope, not optimism, conviction. The kind of conviction that is so thoroughly embedded in the subconscious mind that it shapes behavior automatically without requiring conscious effort or willpower. And here's the paradox. Faith of this kind cannot be manufactured by willpower. It cannot be forced. It cannot be decided into existence through a single act of conscious determination. It is built slowly, consistently, through the accumulated practice of autosuggestion, through the repeated introduction of a clear, emotionally charged desire into the silence of the subconscious mind, through the deliberate management of the thought environment, through the careful selection of the mastermind relationships, through the repeated act of moving toward the desired outcome, even in the face of fear, especially in the face of fear, because each time a man acts in the direction of his desire, despite his fear, he does something to his subconscious programming that no amount of thinking or reading or hoping can replicate. He provides evidence. He gives his own subconscious mind the raw material it needs to build a new belief that he is someone who acts, that he is someone who moves forward, that he is someone for whom the desired outcome is not a fantasy, but a direction. And that new belief, built from the evidence of repeated action, is the foundation of the kind of faith that Hill described as the starting point of all achievement. Bueno, and now we come to the deepest part of this, the part that connects everything and that most people never reach because they stop at the techniques. Napoleon Hill, in his most candid moments, said something that very few of his popular interpreters have been willing to say with the same directness. He said that the single greatest obstacle to the creation of wealth is not lack of knowledge or lack of opportunity or lack of capital. It is the inability to bear the silence long enough to hear what the mind is actually saying. Most people are afraid of silence, not because silence is dangerous, but because silence is honest. In silence, the mind tells the truth. It tells you what you actually believe, as opposed to what you tell yourself you believe. It tells you what you actually want, as opposed to what you have been told you should want. It tells you where your courage ends and your fear begins. And for most people, that honesty is so uncomfortable, so disorienting, so threatening to the carefully constructed self-image that they have maintained for years, that they will choose almost any amount of noise over it. They will choose the TV. They will choose the podcast. They will choose the endless scroll of the phone at midnight. They will choose the conversation that goes nowhere and the busyness that produces nothing. Not because they are weak, not because they are lazy, but because the mind, in its most natural self-protective mode, will always choose the familiar discomfort of its current programming over the unfamiliar discomfort of changing it. And this precise mechanism is what Napoleon Hill identified as the enemy of greatness. Not external circumstances, not economic conditions, not the competition or the market or the timing. The mind's own preference for the familiar prison over the unfamiliar freedom. The most devastating paradox in the entire architecture of human achievement, that the thing which would set you free is the thing your own mind is most determined to avoid. Deham pensar un momento about what that means for your children, about what it means for the people who depend on you. Because the man who never learns to bear the silence is not just limiting himself. He is modeling something. He is demonstrating to the young minds that are watching him, absorbing him, building their own operating systems based on what they observe in him, that silence is to be avoided. That discomfort is a signal to retreat, that the noise and the busyness and the comfortable numbing of the evening are the reward for surviving another day rather than the sabotage of the next one. And those young minds will carry that demonstration forward. They will sit at their own kitchen tables at their own 11:47 at night, with their own stacks of bills and their own cold coffee, and their own unnamed weight behind the sternum, 3 fingers below the collarbone, and they will not know why they are there. They will not trace it back to the modeling they absorbed before they had words for it. They will simply feel the familiar, inherited conviction that this is how life is, that this is what they deserve, that the burning desire they feel, the one that flickers up in the quiet moments before it is quickly suppressed, is not a signal from their greatest self, but a dangerous fantasy to be managed and controlled. Espera, that is the inheritance you are building right now today, with the choices you make about how you use your mind. Not the money you leave, the mind you model, the relationship with silence and desire and faith and action that your children absorb from watching you live. And that is why this is urgent. Not urgent in the anxious, reactive sense. Urgent in the clear, cold, awake sense of a man who has understood something he cannot pretend he has not understood. The time that passes between now and the moment you begin this practice is not neutral. It is not simply time. It is programming. Every day that the current pattern continues is another day of compounding in the wrong direction. Every night that ends with fear as the dominant thought before sleep is another night of reinforcing the exact instruction that your subconscious is using to shape your tomorrow. Aware. So let us be concrete. Let us end with the specific architecture of the practice. Because Napoleon Hill was above all things a man of practical instruction, and he would have had no patience for a conversation that ended in inspiration without implementation. Here's what the practice looks like, assembled from everything we have discussed. The first piece is the 10 minutes of silence every morning, before the noise begins, before the phone, before the news, before the conversation. 10 minutes in which you sit with your spine straight and your jaw unclenched and your breath slow, and you deliberately allow the surface noise of the mind to settle. The way silt settles in a glass of water when you stop shaking it. You do not force the thoughts to stop. You simply observe them and decline to follow them. And when the surface has settled enough, you introduce your desire, clearly, specifically with the full emotional charge it deserves. Pews, the second piece, is the written statement of your burning desire, your definiteness of purpose, which you read aloud every morning during those 10 minutes and every night in the threshold moment before sleep. Not as recitation, as declaration, with the tone of a man who is telling himself a truth that is already real in the only place that ultimately matters, in the mind that is building it. The third piece is the deliberate audit of your thought environment, not a dramatic purge, a conscious, honest assessment. Which relationships are amplifying your desire and which are diluting it? Which habits of media consumption are feeding your subconscious with evidence of possibility, and which are feeding it with evidence of scarcity? Not to judge, not to feel superior, simply to understand the inputs that are currently shaping the programming that is currently shaping your life. Bueno, the fourth piece is action. Specific, immediate, imperfect, courageous action in the direction of your desire. Not action that waits for confidence. Not action that waits for the plan to be perfect. Action that creates the evidence your subconscious mind needs in order to begin building the kind of faith that Napoleon Hill described as the starting point of all achievement. One call you have been avoiding, one conversation you have been postponing, one step toward the thing you want that you take today, not because you're ready, but because readiness is a lie that the comfortable mind tells to protect the prison it has built. And the fifth piece, the one that brings everything together and that most people omit because it feels too simple, is gratitude. Not gratitude as a performance, not gratitude as a list of things you tell yourself you should appreciate. Gratitude as a genuine, felt, physical experience of abundance that already exists in your life right now. Because the subconscious mind, remember, responds to emotional frequency, and the emotional frequency of genuine gratitude, felt in the body, warm in the chest, open in the throat, is the frequency of abundance. It is the frequency that says to the deepest layer of your mind, there is enough, there is more, I'm already in motion toward more. And that frequency, held consistently in the threshold moments of morning and night, begins to replace the frequency of scarcity that has been running, inherited and unexamined. For years, dejam pensar un momento, because we need to close all the loops that are open. We started with Edward, the man with the notebooks in the bottom drawer. We said that what he lacked was not talent or knowledge or opportunity, but silence. And now we can say more precisely what that means. What Edward lacked was the courage to sit in the silence long enough to hear his own desire clearly enough to commit to it, completely enough to act on it consistently enough to build the faith that would have made his action unstoppable. He lacked not the silence itself, but the willingness to use it honestly. And that willingness, that single, deceptively simple willingness, is the difference between the man who dies with his potential intact and the man who dies having spent it. The second loop. We talked about your children, about the inheritance that is not monetary but mental, about the modeling that happens every day in the kitchen and the car and the dinner table conversation. And now we can close that loop too. The way you change what you model is not by pretending to feel things you do not feel. It is by actually changing the programming, by actually sitting in the silence, by actually introducing the desire, by actually taking the action. Because children, who are the most precise observers of emotional truth that exist, will feel the difference. They will feel the shift in the frequency of the household when a man stops running from his potential and starts moving toward it. They will absorb the new modeling before they have words for it, just as they absorbed the old one. And the chain that has run for generations will begin to break, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet, daily, courageous practice. And the third loop, the deepest one, the one we opened at the very beginning with the question that rose up from the kitchen table at 11:47 at night. What if this is all there is? We can close that loop now. Because the answer, the one that Napoleon Hill spent his life demonstrating, is the most paradoxical and the most liberating answer possible. Exactly this, the mind you have right now, the silence you have access to right now, the desire that is burning somewhere beneath the noise right now. This is the raw material of everything, not in spite of where you are, but because of it, because the man who learns to use the silence from the bottom of his circumstances learns something that the man who uses it from the top of his success never has to learn. He learns that the silence is not a luxury. It is the foundation. It is the technology. It is the most powerful thing that exists in the entire field of human achievement, and it has been available to him every single night, in the kitchen, after the children are asleep and the coffee is cold and the bills are on the table and the clock is ticking. The silence was never the problem. The silence was always the answer. And the man who understands that truly understands it, not as an idea but as a practice, not as an inspiration but as a daily discipline. That man is no longer the man who sits at the table wondering if this is all there is. He is the man who knows exactly what there is because he has taken the time to find out. He has gone into the silence, and he has asked the right question, and he has listened long enough to hear the answer. And the answer, every time without exception, in the life of every man who has ever done this with genuine commitment, is the same. The answer is, no, this is not all there is. There is a version of this life that is larger, freer, more abundant, and more meaningful than anything the noise has ever been able to show you. And it is not somewhere else. It is not in the future. It is in the silence, waiting for you to be still enough, honest enough, and brave enough to claim it. That is the power of silence. That is what makes everything flow. Not the absence of struggle, not the removal of difficulty, not the clearing of every obstacle before you move, but the alignment of the deepest part of your mind with the direction of your greatest desire, held in silence, fed with faith, expressed in action, compounded daily, given to your children not as money but as a model, not as a comfortable life, but as a courageous one. That is the inheritance worth building. That is the legacy worth leaving. And it begins tonight in the silence, in the 10 minutes before the noise starts, in the honest, specific, emotionally charged introduction of what you truly want into the deepest and most powerful part of the mind you already have